I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're considering what the recently adopted state budget means for New York's efforts to combat the opioid epidemic, and our guest is Rob Kent, who served as general counsel to the state's Office of Addiction Services and Supports, and now runs a consulting firm focused on drug policy. Welcome back to the show, Rob.
Thanks for having me, David.
Well, let's start with the top-line numbers from the recently adopted state budget, which was dancing around $270 billion. How did the State Office of Addiction Services and Supports fare in this year's allocation of resources?
A very minuscule increase in funding, and most of it, a majority of it, was increased receipt of opioid litigation settlement funds. So it's about $20 million, I think, overall increase.
And how does that compare to recent increases? Is that in line with what has traditionally happened with OASIS? Does this represent some sort of deviation from past funding?
Yeah, I think it's consistent with the underfunding of the system for a long period of time. In all due respect to my, including when I was at OASIS. So we have to fight for table scraps in this space.
Yeah, can you kind of give some context about the funding for this office? I mentioned this is a $268 billion budget. What sort of percentage or how much bandwidth or energy do you think goes to this office and its really important mission?
Not enough from my biased perspective. I mean, it gets about $1 billion overall, but that includes funding that comes in from the federal government as well. And so, to be honest, it's flat, and it's been flat for a long period of time. And so that's why policy issues become that much more important because, and we've talked in the past, there's money in the system. I think Medicaid managed care plans and private insurers are keeping funds that are really should be provided to or made available to providers, and doesn't happen. And so making sure the system operates fairly with the money that's in it is something that I think should be focused in on. And quite honestly, it's not at this point.
And I think that's important context to bring up here about the idea of flat funding, increased funding. What with inflation, even if you're not keeping up with that, then that's a de facto cut because everybody else's bills are rising.
Exactly right. I can remember when I was at OASIS and we'd get the call letter from the budget director saying it's a flat budget. And I would say, well, that's a cut because there's increases based on, the collective bargaining agreements with the state workforce, just overall increase in cost. So when they say flat budget, they still have to come in. And if it's flat, knowing there's already built-in increases, you've got to find savings in other places, which is effectively a cut.
Well, you mentioned earlier the use of funding as a result of opioid settlement dollars, and this has been a point of contention in recent years, whether this money was going to be used as statutorily required to augment the state's existing commitments or whether it would be used to replace state dollars. Does it seem like the money is going to be on top of what maybe they'd already committed to do?
I would love to be able to answer that, but, with a yes or no. But the reality is, can't tell you based on the information that the state makes available, or more importantly, doesn't make available. They're obligated by the law that protected these funds to let people know how much money's coming in, how much has been spent, how much has been committed to multi-year contracts or awards. And they don't put that information out there. And, they cite this web page on the OASIS website. And at the end of it, when you're looking to see how much money went out, they link you back to governor's press releases telling you who got awards. They don't tell you how much money's actually on the street. And so it's hard to tell you that they're spending the money on new things, which they're legally obligated to do, or using it to replace current spending. Really interesting thing happened in this last budget cycle in that, in response to inquiries from the Opioid Settlement Fund Advisory Board, the state disclosed in the fall that it had earned $35 million in interest on unspent funds. Now, two thoughts there. One is I'd love to know who their banker is to pay them that kind of interest. That's a lot of money. Secondly, it speaks to me like they're not spending the money to earn that amount of interest. And so the law was unclear. It still is unclear. That's, some of the legislation that's out there about whether those funds can be used for different purposes or whether they're part of the settlement funds. And this budget kept them separate. And there's been commitments made by Oasis and others that the money will be spent consistent with the law that speaks to how the money should be spent. Now, as someone who's worked in this stuff for, 40 years now, I mean, the way they wrote the language, they could use it for other purposes. I get what they've said they want to do, but stuff happens. So they have authority to use it for other purposes. And it's not just a state thing. Nassau County, it came out that they tried to divert $14 million in interest earned. And I speak to a lot of the families who are really the fundamental basis for why this litigation ever happened and settlements were made. And, to say they're unhappy would be an understatement. They're angry. And, at a time where reimbursement rates are inadequate, can't then therefore hire staff to run programs, you would think they'd be wanting to invest this money in making it better in the system, and it just doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, turning to the policy side of the budget, one of the proposals from the governor that people in the mental health and substance abuse space were both kind of interested in is this idea of a single integrated treatment license. This idea that there are these New Yorkers with what are known as co-occurring disorders. If you have a mental health issue, you may have a substance abuse issue. And this was the idea of trying to streamline the provider experience so they can have a more targeted treatment of these New Yorkers. Ultimately, though, that language was removed, right?
I think there's a separate bill that's moving, is my understanding. Now, the concept's great. I was working on it when I was at Oasis. I really think at this point that this, folks, the legislature ought to go in and just create it in law. The bill that's moving and the language that was in the governor's bill or the governor's budget would authorize Oasis and OMH to create the system. Well, they've been working on that system. They were working on it 6 years ago when I was still at Oasis. So I just think you need to rewrite the law to create this one licensed track, allow Oasis providers to do mental health and some primary care if they have the right staff on an Oasis license and vice versa in the other fields, and then require DOH to set up Medicaid reimbursement authority, be it whether they can do it on their own already with what authority they have or seek federal permission to do it, and start paying these providers to do this work. Now, I know from my experience at Oasis, our providers were providing mental health. They did it because they wanted people to get better. They don't get paid for it. So paying people to do things is the way you're going to get people to do things.
Governor Kathy Hochul has made a big deal about trying to identify red tape that would allow government bureaucracy to maybe move a little smoother and more efficiently if it was cut. And you've talked about sort of harnessing more of the potential of Oasis with some changes to rules and regulations. What are some of the opportunities you think that are out there?
Well, some of their staffing rules, they make sense when you have a workforce that's abundant and you have a pipeline to new workforce that's abundant. They don't exist right now. And so requiring providers to use the highest level professionals. They all want to, they all try to, but they can't afford these folks. They don't want to work in these programs. So looking at opportunities, and even short term, like none of what I'm talking about in the regulatory space as it relates to staffing. You need to change the rules. You could do waivers. There's regulatory waiver ability at Oasis um, to make staffing issues easier to deal with by understanding what the current workforce issues that go on in the system. And for anybody who would argue, well, that might compromise patient safety, there's a whole system set up, the Justice Center, et cetera, to monitor and to ensure that programs are doing things safely and taking action when they aren't. So I think staffing's an issue. Just paperwork generally. A great example. So Oasis providers are subject to the Justice Center when there's an incident that occurs, and so abuse and neglect is the primary focus of the Justice Center. But so when they do an investigation and they find that the claim is unsubstantiated, Oasis is still asking providers to submit a corrective action plan. And I get these calls from providers like, what am I supposed to say? I said, well, tell them you're going to keep doing what you're doing because this didn't happen. But asking for that kind of additional paperwork, the length of time that it takes to investigate folks, and then that puts people out of work in these programs because they're under investigation. And it also makes people leave the field. So there are plenty of opportunities, staffing being one of them, for them to take a look at ways of making it better for providers given the current circumstances. And I hope that happens. I know that folks put forward those kinds of ideas. I know the governor's committed to that. I believe she put a person in charge to oversee this. And I hope it's seen through, because there are some real opportunities to make it easier for the field to do what you want them to do what they want to do, but understanding the current realities on the ground.
Well, finally, we've been having this conversation through the lens of what the state government can do and what they should be doing, what they are doing. But what about the federal government, especially in the last, say, year and a half under the Trump administration? Does it seem like they're moving the ball forward in something like the opioid epidemic, or are they part of, the lackluster response as well?
I think they're part of the lackluster response. And so unlike New York, where the executive really controls the budget, in the federal world, it's Congress. And so a perfect example for over the last two federal budget cycles, the last year, the president's budget proposed to basically combine a bunch of really important federal grants in mental health and substance use and reduce them by $500 million. And then also to take an agency that's part of HHS, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and collapse it into some bigger component of HHS. These were rejected by Congress, but they've been proposed again. So that's an area that people are being very diligent. Congress thankfully has the appropriation authority. They have not agreed. I don't believe they will again, but you're spending energy in that space. And so I think the impact of HR1 is still something we need to see what's going to happen. I mean, the work requirements in order to maintain Medicaid and food stamp eligibility take effect in January 27, and every 6-month recertification of folks. Now, there are exemptions for people who are in addiction treatment, and there's other language that speaks to people who are, well, they've defined medically frail as an exemption, and they include quote unquote substance use disorder. But we need to see how that all plays out, because what you could end up with is people with no insurance, no Medicaid, and understand as well in New York, if you are funded by Oasis, you're obligated to treat anybody who shows up at your front door if
Right.
they meet the need. So does all of this put people out of Medicaid, harder to access treatment, or when they access treatment, create a bigger obligation on the state dollar?
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave things there. We've been speaking with Rob Kent. He's a former general counsel to the State Office of Addiction Services and Supports and now runs a consulting firm focused on drug policy. Rob, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, David.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.